Awesome, students. I know that some of you are struggling a little bit with your essay for the story of an hour. And so what I want to do is just make a short video for you where it sort of touches on the different points that we discussed, both in a small group and then a whole group, the whole class, as well as maybe some of the one-on-one discussions that we had during my office hours. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the document for you, and we'll just sort of walk through it together as a class. Well, kind of virtually, I guess, as a class here. And you'll notice I have some things highlighted. Now, just as a reminder to you, we're not going to touch on everything. Instead, we're just sort of looking at this with that critical lens, specifically that feminist critical lens. And also, I'm not going to talk about everything because it's just sort of a short video, maybe 10 minutes, I hope to make it for you. So without further ado, just sort of let's talk about it a little bit. So we see that first paragraph. It says, knowing that Mrs. Mallory was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. Now, we know that the whole heart thing is going to come back later on with the great irony. So it's a nice sort of frame that's taking place here. But what we see here is a little bit more complex than just a call or foreshadowing of what's going to happen later on with the heart attack. Instead, what we're seeing is that women, once again, are stereotyped. They're stereotyped as being fragile. They're stereotyped as being weak. And because what we're seeing here is she has heart trouble, and then she has to be taken care of in a very gentle way. And then if we jump down later on, we see that she has to be, handled carefully, and she has to have a tender friend talk to her. And so this just feeds into that trope, that stereotype once again, that the patriarchal society sort of paints women as. And then what we also see within this first paragraph, importantly, is her name, Mrs. Mallard. And really, we ask ourselves, is it really a name? Or is it more or less a title? Or is it almost like a branding from her husband, where she has no first name here? Instead, she is owned by Mr. Mallard. Thus, she is Mrs. Mallard. So let's just sort of continue on here. So the news is broken. We fill in more of this sort of stereotype, sort of generalization of women, because it says that she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same. So all women act the same ways, with a paralyzed inability to accept the significance, right? So again, women are weak, women are frail. Now, importantly, she cries. She has grief, if you will. But note the language, the storm of grief. And we're going to come back to that language here because Kate Chopin's going to make allusion towards it with the imagery when the window is open. So she cries, she weeps at once, it says, with sudden wild abandonment. But then when the so-called storm of grief is over, when it's spent itself, she leaves. She goes upstairs by herself. She isolates herself in a room. And then she stands in front of an open window. And then eventually she sits down. Now, the open window is important, of course. Why is it important? Well, the window is what separates you from the outside. And what's the stereotype of where women are supposed to be? Well, they're supposed to be in the home. But there's a window in front of her. And it shows her everything that is available to people, men, who are not locked up in the home, if you will. But interestingly, this window is open. And so she looks out that window. And what does she see out that window? Well, it says, she could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a quiver with the new spring life. Interesting language, new spring life. What does the season spring metaphorically or symbolically stand for within literature many times, within poetry many times, within prose? Well, spring, of course, is new life. It's the birth, it's rebirth, right? When we look at the different seasons, we have spring as new life, right? Summer is just life itself. Fall is decay. Winter is death. So she sees out there new spring life. It's a rebirth. And it's an interesting juxtaposition since Mr. Mallard just died. She also sees the delicious, so it's something good, the delicious breath of rain. Rain, like a baptism, right? Rain to wash things clean. Rain, the rebirth or the renewal of something. And then she sees other things. She sees the street below with the peddler crying his wares. We hear the birds. We talk about the different songs and so on and so forth. So in other words, she's in the house where women, quote unquote, belong. There's an open window, and it's a taste. It's a portal into all that she has always been missing. But now the window is open. But why is it open? Well, it's open for one clear reason, because Mr. Mallard is dead, of course. Because she no longer is stuck under the patriarchal system of the marriage institution as was practiced during the late 19th century. Let's look at the next paragraph here. There were patches of blue sky, showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. This is really important, this language here. Remember, what type of grief did she have? She didn't just cry, she didn't just weep. She had a storm of grief. There's clouds out there. Maybe they're storm clouds. But through those clouds, through those rain clouds, because it does say rain, through that storm, what is she seeing? She's not seeing the storm. She's seeing the patches of blue sky. She's seeing the breaking of all the misery that she might be feeling now, but more importantly, what she was facing then. And she looks at this and she cries just a little bit, but interestingly, she's described as a child. So again, we're back to this fragility thing here. But here's the key thing. Here's a key sentence right here, where Kate Chopin doesn't mince words. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. So she's repressed. But again, she's not focusing on the storm, right? Says, but now there was a dull stare in her eyes whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. She's seen through the storm clouds, right? Was not a glance of reflection, but rather an indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. So she's not glancing at it, she's looking, she's thinking. My, oh my, this open window through the clouds, just like the birds are flying. There was something coming to her and she was waiting for it. Fearfully, what was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, out of the storm clouds, through the patches of blue sky. She can't beat it back, she says, until finally, what does she say? She says, free, 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 right? Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes, and they stayed keen and bright, and her pulse beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. So she was afraid before, but now she gets it. She was afraid that her husband had died because, oh my goodness, deciding what she lived in. Women can't survive without men, supposedly. But now she gets it. Now the window is open. Now she can go through it. But she did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. The joy, obviously, is the possibility of her being, quote unquote, free, being her own person, being her own individual, autonomous self, unlike before. No longer being Mrs. Mallard. Why is it monstrous? Because Mr. Mallard just died. She's pretty happy about that in a restrained, conflicted manner. He's dead, but I'm free. Why is she conflicted? Well, she's a good person, but more so, let's take a look here at this paragraph. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her. But then she goes on to say that now all the years belong to her absolutely. Why is it important that Kate Chopin has made it clear that Mr. Mallard was, in essence, a kind and tender person, a loving person? Because if he wasn't, then the reader would say, well, no wonder this woman, Mrs. Mallard, wants out of this relationship, wants out of this marriage, because this guy's a cad, because this guy's abusive. But when Kate Chopin says that Mr. Mallard was not a bad human being, was a loving husband to the best of his ability, was a kind person, well, now you have to eliminate the fact that Mrs. Mallard wants out of the relationship because he's a bad person. And what's left? Well, you put on your feminist criticism lens and you say the only thing that's left is the reason why she wants out of that relationship is because she no longer wants to be Mrs. Mallard. She wants her to be her own self. She doesn't want to play the role of the wife. She wants to be a human being. She goes on to say that before she dreaded the years that would be before her, but now she gets an opportunity to live for herself. She's in possession of self-assertion. And she says famously, free body and soul free. And once she says, I'm free, notice free body and soul. Once she says that, now Josephine, her sister, is knocking on the door. And what does she say? She doesn't say Mrs. Mallard. She says, Louise, or Louise, open the door. Louise, I'm calling you by your first name. You are no longer Mrs. Mallard. That's not what Josephine means, but you, the reader, get that. And she says, I'm not ill. I am drinking in the very elixir of life through the open window, through the blue patches of sky. There is no storm of grief for me. Because now my days are spring, remember, rebirth. My days are summer days, full of life. She doesn't say they're fall. She doesn't say they're winter. She doesn't say they're days filled with decay and days filled with death. No, no, no. In fact, she shudders that life might be long. She comes out and it's like she's a Valkyrie, like she's the goddess of victory walking down there. And then, lo and behold, in comes Brentley Mallard, the husband. And she sees him. And she gives out a cry. Actually, Josephine gives out a cry, and then she drops dead. And we jump down to the bottom. It says, when the doctors came, they said that she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. And so we go back, of course, to the intro that talks about how, she's got that heart condition going on there. But the doctors, who likely are men, so the reason why she died, of course, was because she was so happy to see Brentley Mallard. Well, she did die from joy. But what type of joy? Well, we already know the type of joy. If we scroll all the way back up here, all the way back up here to the monstrous joy. The joy of her being an independent woman. The joy of her being a person who can be self-asserted. The joy of her being no longer Mrs. Mallard, but being her own self. Louise here. Of living spring days and summer days. What killed her was that was taken away as soon as Mr. Mallard survived. As always, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, you can send me an email or we can meet during your office hours. Just do your best on this essay. We recognize it's your first essay and it's at a level that maybe you guys haven't done for quite some time. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful weekend and I look forward to seeing you very shortly. Bye now.